All right, well, we can get started this morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second session of Shift Your Power. My name is Nikki Fernandez, and I am a Senior Program Associate with the National Network of Public Health Institutes. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a brown-skinned woman wearing glasses that are blue and a black t-shirt with my hair in a bun. I will first start with a few accessibility and technical support reminders. This training is recorded, and an accessible archive of today's conversation will be available in a few weeks. It will include ASL interpretation on screen and closed captionings. Today, American Sign Language ASL interpretation and communication access real-time translation, also known as CART, are available. Today's ASL interpreters are Brenda. We have Brenda and we have, do I see Joel? Yes. And they are already spotlighted for you.
It's Shantae today.
It's Shantae. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. No worries.
And yes, they're already spotlighted for you. If you're having trouble seeing the interpreters, you can change the size of the Zoom boxes, and you can message me for assistance with that. A huge thank you to our ASL interpreters and AI media for today's ASL interpretation and CART captioning. CART via AI media is already embedded in Zoom, and you can access it via the CC button on the navigation bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click once to show subtitles on Zoom. You can also open the CART transcript in a separate window if that is more accessible to you. I will also drop the link in the chat throughout today's session. So just a few reminders before we start our session today. The first thing is to please identify yourself before speaking. Please don't talk over others and keep yourself on mute when not talking. This helps folks with using CART to follow the conversation. Please keep your cameras off unless you are talking, and this helps us to create accessible post-production. And if you're having trouble with your mute button or video, we will help you mute or turn your camera off. I got the power. And please avoid using acronyms for everyone's understanding. I know it's hard to do in public health, but we're all learning here, so. And I will drop a few things in the chat, a few reminders in the chat as well. So with that, I will turn it over to our wonderful facilitator, Jana.
Peace and greetings, beautiful humans. Welcome. My name is Jana Behrens. I am one of the consultants on the consulting team for this ECHO mini-series, Shift Your Power. I have been speaking on these sessions for the last two, and will continue for this one and next week, which is our last one. Feels like it went by really fast. I use she and they pronouns. Before I move forward, a little bit more information here for you all. I am a light-skinned Black woman. I am wearing black rimmed glasses on my face right now. I am wearing some gold earrings that are about the size of my palm, the shape of the continent of Africa. And I have black curly hair that's piled on top of my head in a little ponytail. In back of me, I have a bookshelf with some of my favorite Black authors and people who have taught me a lot in life. I also have to one side my Wakanda warrior. It is a cardboard cutout from the Wakanda Forever movie that came out in November. I thought it was cool. And I also lovingly call Okoye my admin staff and protector. And then on the other side, I have a guitar that I started learning in 2021 as part of self-care. I have fallen off of my self-care, but I am planning to get back to it with intention and create time for rest, joy, pleasure, and honoring my boundaries this year. I hope you do the same. I'm going to pull up my slides. As you all have been hearing or experiencing thus far, we are making strides to be intentional about accessibility. And there are so many things to learn around accessibility. As Nikki just said, we are all learning. And I would say we're all wise. We all have things to contribute. And we're all in different parts of our life, which means we can, on our path and journey, which means we can share these gifts with each other in community, which I hope is why one of the reasons you've come today. On the screen right now, I've pulled up my slide deck. I will do my best to describe things that are on the slides and admit that this is different and new for me, but it's exciting to be getting into practice and thinking about things that I've not thought about previously. That is part of equity work, period. So all of these mini series are really about inviting some discomfort. On the screen, I have the words honesty, humility, humanity for healing and hope. These are words that I hold with me. These are what I always carry with me in any place and space. At the top of the slide, there's an icon for a head. It has a head and a brain in it for bringing in data, intellectual knowledge, plus coming in with heart. The icon of a heart is on the screen because we need to feel to heal. And our emotions are part of our human experience, also information and education for the journey. And lastly, I have an icon here of hands, 5 pair of hands coming in together, tip to tip, to represent collective care, collective action. We are better together. We cannot do this individually. Our liberation, our freedom is bound. And neuroscience even tells us that we come onto this earth wired to connect with one another. So we simply cannot do this work alone individually or as public health as a discipline. This is all of our work. So what I want to bring in that I've brought in all other sessions is my invitations to notice your feelings and your tensions, to sit in your discomfort and explore why you have these feelings, and to take care of yourself as you need. And as a small reminder, to hold on to discomfort leads to discovery. So that feeling in your gut of challenge to whatever your normal thinking is or normative thinking, there is a lesson to be learned there. Why are you having discomfort? Follow that, and there are answers. It may take you a few whys, but keep going. And also take note of things you want to learn more about, because this is a small part of the journey. There is a process to doing equity work that is required of us, different from other training sessions that we may do in public health. Continue to be critical and ask why. Exploration is education. And that's what we've been talking about thus far. And last but not least, certainly lace this space with grace for humanity, for imperfection, for technology, also imperfect. And so there's a lot of imperfect things happening in life and in our spaces right now, and we want to hold grace for that. And I invite you all to take what you need and leave what you don't as we pull out for our journey today. Thank you for being here. If you notice I'm talking slowly, it is because I am. I tend to get very excited and passionate. So if anyone needs me to slow down, please let me know. I am getting in the practice of being more accessible through speed and slowing down. And actually, that's a good lesson for us in general. It's okay to slow down. So today's session is Power in People, Mitigating Performance to Expand Possibilities and Potential. And it's really about changing how we be together to transform what we do together. What I'm going to do mainly for this session, there's going to be a lot of repeating and reiterated concepts, definitions that I've shared over the last 2 sessions. I think it's important that we continue to share them in this way because we are emerging into this idea of equity as a process / practice, not just an outcome. And that takes a little adjustment because that is not traditionally how we have looked at equity. We focus a lot in our organizations around human doing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that before we get into the case study, right before we get into the case study. But I really want to, again, bring in this through line we've been talking about, and we're going to continue peeling back these layers. So today we really want to think about shifting from blaming and shaming people to naming power. How is power showing up? Who's being impacted and how? And again, there's a lot that can go into this session, but really had to bring it down to streamline it. This is also about creating a container for systems change processes, a shared working and thinking space that allows for different set of relational dynamics. How are we building relationship with each other, and how does that then impact the communities and people we serve outside of our four walls? And for our culture to emerge, and to actually work together to tackle complex problems, it takes all of us, and we have to be able to build relationship both inside and outside of our institutions. And that we must integrate the head and heart that I brought in earlier before I even started, to make space alongside data and intellectual knowledge to also feel the physical sensations and emotions that come up when we're confronting the reality of racial inequities. The unjust power imbalances should make us feel a certain way, both in policies and systems that we're aiming to shift, and in our own organizational culture. It's what I call me, we, us. It is an inside out approach. So there are multiple things that are happening at the same time. It is both and, not either or. And I did want to just bring in this quote. I've been bringing in quotes at the beginning as part, just to be inspired and motivated. And I just want to remind you all that one part of my life that has been part of both my personal and professional life is learning in community. This is indeed a community. Now, it's important that when you work with communities, that you're defining what community means and what it looks like. But this, to me, is a community where we are learning to see how our ideas are changing and shifting over time. And that hopefully when we do this, we develop and change over time with those varying ideas and experiences that may be outside of our own. And that we apply our lived experience, our life experience, to our way of seeing the world. I often hear in these spaces that lived experience is so important, but we continue to not honor that. We continue to not honor the stories that are historically rooted within the challenges that we're trying to face. Community is an incredible way to get access to information you may not come across on your own. Relationships are indeed information and education. They are exploration. And when people think the same idea and move in the same direction, it's a cult. But when people think different ideas and move in one direction, that's a movement. So studying, learning, growing collective wisdom together with respect for our ecosystem of ideas is movement. Adrienne Maree Brown, who is one of my favorite activists, doulas, beautiful humans, says that when more people imagine together and then step from imagining into thinking through structures and protocols together, then more needs are attended to. And that's from her book, Emergent Strategy, which I've been using over the last 5 years with public health groups, collaborations, partners. I do resistance groups. And so reading and learning together and seeing and hearing other people's ideas around these concepts of nature and building relationship that is natural to us as human beings and part of this larger ecosystem is important for the work of equity and shifting power. So I wanted to bring this in also as a resource. Adrienne Maree Brown, Emergent Strategy, actually got introduced to this book in a health equity fellowship that was for public health and was a very life-changing moment in my life and career. So hold that with you as we go through and think about, again, this is just a repeat, a review that viewing health equity as a process and outcome requires us to shift power, which means we are actively promoting policy systems and overall community conditions. We are seeking to remove systemic and structural barriers. And these barriers are including racism, gender discrimination, poverty, ableism, other forms of oppression, right? And what has come up in every session is that it's not just about race, but we must understand race as the root, and then understand how that pattern of power imbalance that contributes to race and racism in our society, in our minds, in our bodies, in our systems, in our organizations, is the same pattern that causes ableism, ageism, homophobia, that people are getting locked out and treated differently because of who they are authentically. We must understand that that is the work of us in shifting power in order to get to equity. And then, only then will everyone have a fair and just opportunity to achieve optimal health and well-being. And so what I just described to you all, I feel it, I hear it, I see it, all my senses are engaged when I talk about this, and I cannot reiterate enough how important it is to understand race at the root, that racism is not a separate dimension of power. It runs through all aspects of our society, and any intervention or solution that challenges structural racism also challenges other power imbalances that form oppression, that maintain this imbalance that we see through well-documented inequities. And if we're thinking about this systemically, racism is the blueprint and the through line. It has taught other forms of oppression on how to oppress, and that we're literally just pulling out populations of people and putting them in superior versus inferior based on who's in power to decide who's valuable, who's good, who's right, who are we building buildings for, who is going to have access to these different services, systems, and our social determinants of health. And so when we look at it as a blueprint and through line, we also understand that within these other groups of minoritized people, for instance, older adults or younger adults, folks who have disability, physical and or cognitive, right? Folks who maybe love someone from the same sex. How is this showing up in these groups? That even groups that are minoritized outside of race, that in those groups, Black and brown people are having the worst outcomes because of the double jeopardy, that we simply cannot skip over race. We must understand where all forms of injustice are rooted. And that is by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined this term intersectionality because of her work with Black women, understanding that Black issues tend to focus on men, women issues tend to focus on white women, and in that, Black women were literally falling in between the cracks, literally invisible. And there's lots of different statistics and data around this. And so she named this that we have to understand the overlapping of disadvantage. But another way to think about this, conversely, is that we also have advantage. We also have advantage in different spaces and places, and that this can change depending on where you are and your safety. So then the bringing in the definition of racism, Dr. Kamara Jones, who's on this screen, light-skinned Black woman speaking in front of a microphone. I've been following her my whole career. She names racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on social interpretation of how one looks. It unfairly disadvantages some people and communities while unfairly advantaging others simultaneously at the same time. And so she talks about 3 different types, but we are talking about structural institutional racism, even though all of these interact and impact each other. It's still important to understand we're talking about the social and institutional power, right? So that's when that structure and institution comes in with race prejudice. It is a system of advantage for those considered white and of oppression for those who are not considered white. It is a white supremacy system. Now, in last week's session, Knowledge is Power, I shared part of my origin story, part of the analysis that I used for some of the work that I had done around social determinants of health, including housing, and how important it was for me to understand historical housing policies in order for me to talk about inequities that were showing up in schools, in housing, in health or quality of health that were located in certain zip codes or communities. How are these shaped by government sanctioned policies? What knowledge is forming the work that we want to dismantle, what we want to change, like what do we want to work on? We can't just act like it happened overnight, but what are the roots? And we must name that. And so I shared that when I talk about white supremacy system, it is not about KKK or alt-right groups. It is about this idea of whiteness as rightness and who's had the power to shape how we operate and how we do things in our society. And so with that, I brought in my historical timeline, which I admitted was a little convoluted in the last session. But my question, as I use my historic timeline, and there's many timelines out here when you're thinking about your origin story, but the question that I asked, it ties in my racism definition from Dr. Kamara Jones. Who's being advantaged and who's being disadvantaged? And if we go through and look at some of our policies, if we go into our organizations right now and look at some of our policies, we could ask these same questions. Who's being advantaged and who's being disadvantaged? If you look at the small print. And so that's what I kind of did with this timeline. I use these in much broader conversations of learning and growing together that are longer than just, a 90-minute community. But I just wanted to bring this in, that this is part of my analysis and that I shared my truth acknowledgement. And that if we look at some of these enactments or policies, They are dehumanizing, like the 3/5 compromise that deemed Africans 3/5 human. They are diminishing, like the Indian Removal Act that literally removed indigenous and native peoples from the land they were cultivating for centuries before Christopher Columbus and other European colonists came and said that they had found this land, right? The diminishment, the dismissal, the dehumanization, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, massive land theft, Chinese Exclusion Act, excluding ethnicity by name. If you go and look at the fine print and ask who's being advantaged and who's being disadvantaged, there's this compilation of power that starts to rise to one side. And that's what we're talking about when we say whiteness as rightness. Who's had the power to shape how we do things, to shape laws, policies, and uphold them? Because we know that policies are important, but who writes our policies? Who upholds our policies? Who's impacted by our policies in very different ways? And I call this the legacy of lockout. That is what I call my origin story. And I just named that our country was founded on land taken from its people, people taken from their land and exploited for labor. And then these different laws which advantage and disadvantage people simultaneously based on the social interpretation of how they look. And that we simply cannot talk about America without talking about race, because when you scramble those letters, it is literally spells I am race, and that is foundational. And then I brought in the human hierarchy, housing and health, and that really shaped a lot of the work I was doing in Durham, North Carolina, where I was a health educator in community practice. I worked in community practice for 16 years, both at the YMCA and the County of Public Health. 11 years at one, 12 at the other, 8 at the same time, seeing the same population of people. In my underserved programming at the YMCA and at my clinic programs and education classes, et cetera, in the health department. What this told me was there was more to the story that wasn't showing up in our data. And this hierarchy is what comes of that historical origin story that I have, that European people at the top, African slaves, American Indians at the bottom, and that hierarchy shows up in our data. So on the screen right now, we have a hierarchy. We have a screen, we have a picture with a European colonist at the top, African indigenous person at the bottom. That is the hierarchy that emerged, the original emerging. We know that hierarchy has changed as other people have come into the fold. European immigration versus immigrants of color. There's been a different welcoming into our hierarchy as well. But on the right side, we have the racial wealth gap. If we took this out and put chronic disease in there, it would look the same. If we took this out and put home ownership in there, it would look the same. If we took this out and put education and put employment and put social services access, et cetera, it doesn't matter what we change this out to, the hierarchy still comes out the same because they are patterned, systemic, unjust, and actionable.
Hey, Jana, would you mind slowing your pace a little bit?
Okay.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
sorry. Yes, thank you. Yeah, if you are trying to send me a chat, it distracts me, so I have it on this screen. Thank you, Nikki. Just you can just interrupt me anytime. All right, I promise you we're getting to the point, okay? And so on the screen right now, there's this big lake surrounded by trees. And in the big lake are smaller circles that I just created. And each of these circles represents another body of water. And each of these systems represent inequities that are racial inequities that exist in our data in each of these systems, or what we could also call social determinants of health. Some people call them social contributions to health. And what we know is that in our socioeconomic status, we have a racial wealth gap, which is racial inequities caused by racial inequities. Housing, there's a home ownership gap. This is nationwide, all right? But you also may find this as you bring it down to the state and bring it down to cities and towns. There are different nuances based on geography. Again, that ties back to history as well, but these patterns scale up and back down. In education, we have an achievement gap, racial inequities. The food system, we have food deserts, we have food swamps. Deserts, lacking full service grocery stores, swamps, the oversaturation of convenience stores, bodegas, dollar stores, a lot of sugary drinks, foods, high fat, etc. also the place where chronic disease is very high. That's where you find these food deserts and swamps. That's just a side note. Criminal justice system, we have disproportionate minority contact in our health system, health disparities. Inequities cause gaps and disparities. They are not one and the same. And in fact, if we're talking about them separately, like each of these circles are to themselves, then we're not making what's invisible visible. And that's that the groundwater or the root is the issue. And you can learn more about that from the Racial Equity Institute groundwater analogy, which is a great analogy about how our systems are set up. And we're working against the same challenges, but we do not talk to each other. And that we should be looking systemically at all of our systems and how they interact in the water, and that all water is really, most bodies of water are connected by the groundwater. So even if you cleaned out each of these bodies of water, they would get retainted. And so we must understand systemically how inequities show up, and then systemically how we must address these power and pattern imbalances. This is the water we're swimming in. So on the screen, there's right now a picture of a fish in a fishbowl asking water, what water? And then we have a human looking around up at the sky, culture, what culture? And the fish in the water don't know if the water is dirty or clean, if it's all they've ever known. And nor should we expect that. And so when we think about power imbalance and that pattern, how it shows up in history, how it shows up in society, in our data, maybe in the human hierarchy that we don't want to admit exists, how does it show up in our organizations? How does this show up in our organizations? And that's where we are right now, because when we can name how power imbalance shows up in our organizations, we can start to see loopholes, because we know things may not change overnight. We know that. But we know that if we can name what we're working in, we can find other ways of being. And so what I'm bringing on the screen right now is something I call the box of bureaucracy or barriers. You can use as well the other B word. And I'm going to bring in one side of the box at a time. So the first side I'm bringing on the left-hand side says funding. That's one side of our box. Bringing in the top side of the box, we have policies here. So we're building a box going around clockwise. Bringing it around to the right side, the third side right now, this says time. So the third side of our box says time, and then the last side of our box says hierarchical power dynamics. And so just, I'm just gonna leave this here for a moment, and hopefully you're following, and maybe you've seen this box before. This is the box that we're tethered to. This is the box that we tend to use whether we're thinking about organizations. This may be your office, could be your cubicle. This could be the table we invite people to. Frameworks have 4 sides typically, and all frames don't work. So anything that's a square, I just want you to be thinking about where you see yourself, and where have you seen yourself tethered to these 4 things: funding, policies, time, and hierarchy within our organization, or power dynamics, right? When we talk about upper leadership, middle management, frontline workers. And then in the middle, running in the middle of this box, we have our organizational culture and norms that we'll bring in. So perfectionism, we can't make mistakes, got to be perfect. Sense of urgency, always go, go, go. We got to turn this grant around in 1 week, 2 days. Quantity over quality, wanting more, wanting bigger progress. We want to train more people. How good is the training, and what is the impact? Really thinking about quantity versus quality, which quality is super important as well. Progress is just going bigger, expanding, more. That could be more money, it could be more initiatives, but often may not have the capacity, especially when we think about local public health, local government, and our counties, health departments. Either or thinking, or binary thinking, we can either do one thing or the other. There's never this understanding that multiple experiences could be happening. And in fact, if we think about our policies, they are impacting employees or your colleagues differently depending on the social interpretation of how they look. Power hoarding, holding the power, knowing we have power, We are power brokers in our organizations. Even folks who say, oh, well, I just do admin or I just do IT. You have power because you are tethered to an organization that has power. Paternalism, which is, oh, you know, we have all the right answers. We have the PhD, we have the evidence-based research and data. And I often ask evidence-based for who and by who, because my experience was translating curriculum into communities did not work very well for me. I had to do a lot of extra leg work, body work, mind work, thought work. Listening is learning. So listening to elders, I could not just go in and do work as a public health practitioner, not in real communities where folks know what they need. So that's just the reality. And then individualism, which I said earlier at the top of the hour, like we cannot do this individually as a discipline, but as people, like we need each other. So where is the room for relationship building? And I'm going to ask you all, you know, as we get into this case study conversation, I'm going to stop. I had more, but I want to stop because it's just, there's a lot here. And I want to bring that case in, and I just wanted to have some time here that you all see on the slide that we have this box, and the box is funding, policies, time, power dynamics. We're tethered to this. And then within this box, or at this table that we're sitting at, or being part of this framework, within there, we have all these different characteristics, which in my mind feel very anti-human when we think about individualism. And I just said earlier, we're wired to connect. So some of these traits are not human-centered. And the sense of urgency when we're going fast, even just me just going fast just now, getting excited, we leave people behind when we do that. And so I want you all to just think, where have you seen this come up in yourselves? Where do you see it come up in your organizations? Is this something that you've experienced at any job or any place that you've worked or any group that you've worked with? And I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you all for the chat. I was just catching up. And so hopefully, as Corey comes in with this case example, you all have been thinking around everything I shared and then how it shows up in our organizations. Corey, I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Jana.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I am Corey Thomas. I use she, her pronouns. I have a kind of burnt orange shirt on. I have a long blonde, dirty blonde hair. I have white skin, and behind me is two beautiful plants on plant stands with books. And I'm really excited and feel honored to be here today to present an anonymous case study. So we had this submitted a couple weeks ago, and are really excited to be able to pull this in this week. This is a equity in action case example from a statewide coalition. We want this space to be a place, I am typically a consultant on this project, so we had this case submitted, and I get the honor of presenting anonymous cases to just protect the grantees, protect this space, to be able to ask really honest and open questions of each other. So sometimes that can be hard. Hopefully this is an opportunity for us to really have some pure learning. So we have a summary based on what's going on. So the current state of this state example is everybody is exhausted. It looks like there's difficulty collaborating and communicating. I think I'll make some assumptions based off of that box of bureaucracy that Jana just mentioned, that some of those cultural norms are influencing that. Some varying level of experience and knowledge when it comes to equity and justice especially when it is in practice. So moving from this theory to practice, if people are learning or integrating lived experience. Looks like there's no collective definition or clear vision for mobilization. And in a bit, we'll highlight that term in the context of this particular CDC grant and what we're tasked with. Defaulting to past and familiar power structures. Again, it was great seeing the box of bureaucracy kind of name that. And this is showing up particularly in decision making. So when we are moving quickly, how do we default to these familiar power structures? This quote unquote white savior complex. So this idea of having good intentions. I think that Jana, you just mentioned in the context of paternalism as well. So good intentions, but also having some negative impact, particularly on Black, Indigenous, people of color, or members of the LGBTQ plus community within the public health workforce as well. Some additional context they offered was that this current coalition was formed before COVID-19, which is I think important context. But some of that relational infrastructure that's so important to doing equity work was on pause in the 2 years in that direct kind of emergency response, as most members were involved in the COVID-19 response. So some important timing context. They've been actively trying to integrate anti-racist practices across agencies, including state health department, local health departments, public health associations, hospital system partners, academic partners, and etc. So there's a strong commitment to learning in the professional space and some difficulty recognizing opportunities to put that learning into practice. So that's referencing what they mentioned in that current state. Their vision is to advance justice through education, community mobilization, advocacy, coordinated efforts, leadership development, and innovative cross-sector solutions. And some questions from last week that we'll kind of move through based off of this week's questions. Some power in people. They are looking for some examples, some definitions, some roadmaps, some anything to help with that mobilize factor. So the content below the question is pulled directly from the CDC site related to this grant. Mobilize partners and collaborators to advance health equity and address social determinants of health as they relate to COVID-19 health disparities among populations at higher risk that are underserved. Or what I like to emphasize is historically underrepresented and acknowledged. The second question leads to that point. There are several white, cis, able-bodied women in health equity positions in these public health equity roles. And so they are curious about what is the role of white, cis, able-bodied women in these health equity positions. So I'm going to leave these questions on the chat and hand it back to you, Jana, to facilitate some discussion around some of this particular equity in action case example, what they're looking for, and see what we've got in this group of incredible peers to tap into.
Woo, woo. Thank you for sharing that, Corey. Wow. I have to say, it actually feels familiar to me. And so I will say that, I guess I've seen, different similar issues with different collectives that I've worked with. So I want to say this is not abnormal when you're thinking about change. I often say change is hard, even for change makers. Because we're so, as I think Serena put in the chat box earlier, talking about traditional ways in which we do things. How often do we say, well, how things are? Well, how long that takes. And we fall into line around these ways that are operating that may not be the best, that I think that we know are not the best, not just for our communities, right? But for us as well. So what's coming up for me here with just these questions and what you shared is there's an internal struggle as well, because it seems like this group wants to do some great things, but it may not be clear on what everyone's role is based, again, on their social interpretations. I like to always bring in Dr. Kamara Jones' definition. It's always in the back of my mind. I actually like these questions right here on the slide right now, Corey, that said, what are some examples, definitions, or roadmaps to mobilize? And I love this question around what is the role of white, cis, able-bodied women in health equity positions, but really all of us. Really, what is our role and how do we learn our role? And I often say we have to slow our roll to know our role, because that sense of urgency has us moving so fast that we skip over the building of relationships that really help us to learn what our role is. And if we can name that box and say, okay, this box is here, how do we build relationships? How do we do things in spite of? And I'm gonna tell you, there's a lot of people on this earth that know how to do things in spite of, that know how to get things moving, even when we have the box of bureaucracy or barriers in the way, because there is power in people, even though we know that social, economic, and political power hold some weight. We know when people come together and start working through their issues together, that there's power in people, right? I do want to invite participants to come in and speak. I also want to invite our illustrious panelists to come off of mute and share anything around these questions that are coming up for you. But first, I do want to pose, has anyone in this space ever felt the box of bureaucracy? And have you ever felt like, what does this bring up for you, this whole conversation around this box and equity?
Hi, this is Stephanie.
Hey, Stephanie.
Hi, I am one of the panelists, but I would like to share that I am a Indigenous woman who is an elder, and so I have been doing this work for many, many, many years. And when I see these questions, it just reminds me so much of the box that I've lived in and worked in for so many years. And for me personally, the way that I have gotten out of this box is to leave the bureaucratic structures that have been so powerful in causing inaction. And so that is why I chose to start my own small business, because I have the capability to do that. And when I think about what has happened with mobilizing the partners and collaborators during COVID, I received funding from the Rocky Mountain Public Health Training Center to do some work in COVID and health disparities amongst the Latino and Native American communities in Colorado. And as I stated last week, one of the things that we saw was the significant number of cases of COVID on the reservations, and the lack of resources, and the government who didn't show up, and people who started their own GoFundMe in order to be able to respond to it. And so I see that we must work both internally and externally of that box in order for us to make progress that we need. And sometimes, even though as hard as it was for me to swallow the fact that the government didn't show up to the reservations for a very long time, and that they were forced to do GoFundMe's, but at least they found a way to be able to serve their people, and they mobilized their partners in order to do that. And we saw a significant loss on the reservations, and primarily the elders. And with the elders were the historical knowledge that has been lost and will never be recovered. And so it is just so challenging as we work in and outside of that box. But I challenge every one of us to do that. I recently, it was my birthday, and I had a card from a friend who said, "It was so nice to meet such an accomplished and quote, get her done gal." And sometimes I have issues with people who don't understand that I have no time to waste. I have no time to work on projects that aren't going to be impactful. And I really need to get shit done. And so when I look about the role of the white cis-able body woman, I just started thinking of a county outside of Denver called Adams County, and they just broke off and started their new health department. And the woman in charge of the health equity is a white cis-able-bodied woman in a community that is highest number of people of color than any of the counties that we have in Denver. And there was just a big story on the news about her wanting to collaborate and mobilize partners who are working with those groups. So I find it very challenging that they cannot find people with lived and living experience to hold those positions because we are being excluded. I personally have 2 master's degrees and 1 in public health, and people who are no more qualified than myself, but I hear them all the time saying, "We can't find them, they don't exist," but they're not looking either in the right places or they're not looking at all. So I find it very challenging that they have these women in power that have no lived and living experience that are working in health equity. I challenge them to do the work, but I also challenge them to find the people that are those who have been most impacted and have been in the high needs and under-resourced communities.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Always, always a gift to hear you speak and share much of your story, your life, which is your work. And everything you said is so important. I see that Corey put here, what they're hearing is find people who have lived experience for these health equity roles. I would even say, yes, and that both and, right? Like we all have roles, but learn your role of leadership in this may look different depending on where you are impacted or how you're impacted. We all are impacted, right? But is asking yourself, is this really the role for me? And if not, who should I be supporting? Who should I be shifting resources to? Who should we be listening? Because listening is an action and listening is learning. So I really appreciate you saying that, Stephanie, because I too have had the same experience in a whole different part of the world in North Carolina when I worked there. And I worked at a health department, and what I found were that there was these great stories on the front lines, but somehow they weren't moving up through the organization. So they weren't coming out. And folks who were on the front lines working directly hand in hand, and I mean hand in hand because I was one of those people with community members and residents that like they knew us, but they didn't know the people in the organization. So when we think about that, and Corey just asked, could you share some of the tactics that you use? One of the tactics that I think is important is to check the folks in your organizations. Don't count people out because they don't have degrees. I have found I was one of the people that didn't, and even when I did, like you, Stephanie, have 2 master's degrees, still could not get to the table because I was speaking truth. And so I think that I had to understand that working my role inside and out, it shifted as I grew in my awareness and my knowledge, right? What we talked about in the last session, and then the relationships that I built. Because I knew I had a badge on. I couldn't do certain things, but I could build relationships with people who could advocate, who could show up to city council, who could show up and, speak for folks. So thank you, Stephanie. And I'm going to invite you in to share what are some of the tactics or strategies that you use in the tribal and Latinx communities. Thank you, Stephanie.
Actually, I mean, the number one tactic that we utilize is identifying trusted community leaders who have been doing this work. And in the Latino community, we're doing it through the promotoras model or conectoras or navegadoras. And so those are the people that are out in community that have earned that trust, that speak the language, that look like them, that they can trust. Because I've been doing this work for over 40 years, sometimes I just blow myself away when someone will call me and ask me for a resource, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I know that? And it's like, because I've been doing the work for so long. And so I identify those individuals, I work with them, we find them ways, I find ways to help with compensation. I do not ask anybody to come to my table unless I am paying them, compensating them for the work that they are doing. And in the tribal communities, it's a little bit more challenging because you have in Denver, there is no actual reservation close by. We have most of the people who have left reservations are either coming from Navajo Nation in the Four Corners, or they're coming from South Dakota, from Pine Ridge, primarily. And so there's a term that is used that is called reservation or urban Indians. So what you do when you're coming and working with the urban Indians that have come from the reservation is the same philosophy as the trust, but you identify the organizations that are doing the work. I have an amazing, amazing network of people that I have worked with in both of those communities. And anytime we have something that is going on, I reach out to them and say, hey, Walt, hey, Cheryl, hey, whoever that is doing that work, and ask them, I'm working on this project, bring me in. We have this amazing woman named Shannon Francis that has an organization that's called Spirit of the Sun. And she is doing amazing work here. And so you can tap into her and the people that she has. So I think the crux of it is identifying those trusted leaders in community and finding a way to compensate them for the work that they're doing, because we're no longer going to do this work for free.
Thank you, Stephanie. Two really important things. Find your people and pay people their value, their worth. Absolutely. If it's even possible. Thank you for sharing. Jordan. Oh, before I invite Jordan in, one of our panelists, I did want to just uplift something that Meg shared in the chat. Thank you, Meg. I didn't know if you wanted to come off mute and expound on what you dropped. Would love to hear from ya.
Thanks, Dana. This is Meg and Tracy, and I'm at the Rural Institute. My pronouns are she, her. And one of the things that, I'm reflecting so much on what Stephanie said and trying to bring that home to the work that I do as somebody who identifies as a cis woman, non-disabled, coming up with the positionality statements for our team members. Right to what Stephanie's saying, we need trusted members of the disability community to have those hard conversations. These are, how do I identify? That's scary, right? Like, you're going to tell me, and just really trying to create space, grace, all of that with people who are paid to share their cultural knowledge. People with disabilities share so much how they are stopped on the street, and asked to share about disability. It's a subject matter expertise. It's a burden. It needs to be organized into a space that is, compensated, and people can plan into the rhythm of their day. And so we need to, hold that up, acknowledge that we are asking for their support, and anyway, just not always asking our members of underserved, underrepresented, multiply marginalized groups to carry the burden of health equity without acknowledging it specifically in the work.
Thank you, Meg. So important. Yeah, absolutely. And paying folks, because it is exhausting, and it is expertise. It is wisdom. We're always extracting from in public health data as well. It's another form of data that we're expecting folks to give us. So absolutely, thank you for those nuggets. I did want to also invite another panelist, Jordan X to come off mute if he wanted to sprinkle his hot sauce. Hey, Jordan, I see you.
Hey y'all, hey y'all.
Share to the conversation, Jordan.
Yeah, I also just want to introduce myself. My name's Jordan X. I use he, him, his pronouns. Currently living in what's now known as Lansing, Michigan. I'm a queer, Black, poly individual in my 30s. And my background is in grassroots organizing, some call it outside organizing. I was out there on the front lines doing work with Black Lives Matter before 2020. So I come with that perspective, and I think, Jana, you uplifted this framework. And when I was looking at this framework, the box, I saw gatekeepers. I think that's what I was seeing in there, right? And I know as we talk about systems, as we talk about how to do this work, we really try to focus on systems, right? Ooh, is my camera not working?
I see you fine. Hi.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I just saw something in the notes, wanted to make sure we're all good. But when I saw that, I saw the box and saw gatekeepers. And in these systems we find ourselves in, and I say we, meaning myself in a nonprofit, as a consultant, myself being in this space right now, I say we, us in public health, we are gatekeepers, right? And one of our roles is to get rid of that gate, to sprinkle seeds instead of making more gates, right? We want to build a garden of resistance, a garden of community. And one example I thought of defining that, showing how we mobilize. First, I need to share an example of my past history. I used to go work in schools, and when I was at inner city school, high school, I go in there because a couple weeks before there was a fight that involved about 5 different individuals. Police were called. Days later, the day after, we hear from city officials, we hear from the news what's going on with these children, what's going on with these parents, what's going on with this community. So I'm like, look, we can go talk. So I show up in the school, and one of the first things I see is a kid isn't in class, and a security guard is chasing him saying, if you don't get in class, you can just go home. And it taught me a couple things in that instance, right? That education really wasn't the purpose that the school was trying to get across here. It was, we're showing you we can police you, and if you don't listen, you go home. And it taught me another thing. Maybe you'll pick up on this one when you hear the second story. Like I said, I'm from Lansing, Michigan. About 3 weeks ago, there was a shooting in my neighboring city of East Lansing and MSU, right? I guess it's maybe been a little longer now, right? And that tragedy had me, so many others shook, right? That there was a shooting at a place that we value for education of our children. The next day, I remember seeing the whole community, from the city council to our state governor, to the schools, to all of our state health departments, to our individual therapists, to the white women that are ready to give some hugs, and everywhere in between, everyone is ready to come support that community and be in community. Because I'm just going to tell you something. We already know how to be in community, and that day showed me, right? And something, again, I want to circle back to is that box you showed us, Shanna. We think of all of these resources, power, wisdom. We don't need more gatekeepers in the way, right? We don't need more policies to say, hey, we need to send police to this school because they have Black children and we see them as criminals. No. Let's get rid of that tape. Let's get rid of all the gatekeeping that says, let's do that. Let's open up what we already know how to do. Let's go back to community. Let's go to that. Let's go back to being community, right? Can we do something together, right? We know how to, because I promise you, the day after that shooting, when from Lansing to East Lansing to Ann Arbor, people are wearing Survivor Strong, I feel like we know how to come together, right? There's something in us that we know how to do. Maybe these boxes, these bureaucratic things are the things getting in the way, right? Maybe we need to look a little bit more inside what bureaucracies we're willing to say, nah, we can skip that. And we are on a Saturday going to come together and be in community.
Well, Jordan, pass the mic and drop it. Then I'll pass it back. Thank you. We know how to do it because we already doing it. This is the community indeed. And when you just said that, I thought about how that box also shows up in us. And because we are socialized in that box from school, from the story you shared, from the moment we hit these systems all the way through. And that box shows up as our best friend in every space and place. And it shows up in us. Perfectionism shows up in us. Sense of urgency shows up in us. How are we all being impacted by this anti-human box? I love how you pulled that all together, Jordan. I don't know if you meant to do that, but I appreciate the emergence. Wow. Stephanie, I see that you put nothing about us without us, which I had to lift up because that is from the disability justice movement, and many justice movements have borrowed it. And it really says it all. Nothing about us. Who's most impacted? Those are the folks that need to be leading our transformation inside and outside of our walls, right? And I think you both spoke to the both and of that. Meg, come on in. I see your, wait, I do see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Jordan, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And Stephanie, thanks for bringing that. Another mantra from the disability community is free our people, which is because so many of the structural systems, they lead to institutionalization for people with disability. And, the Olmstead Act and all of the work of the community is about trying to create lifelong, self-determined lives in our communities. And I think that is a point of intersection that we share in health equity, but nothing about us without us, and free our people.
I love that. Thank you, Meg Tracy. Free our people. And here's the thing about freedom. If I'm not free, you're not free. And that's from Fannie Lou Hamer, who's a Black woman, and I don't need to say much more, who fought for her communities politically, socially, economically, every which way. I would love to, yeah, Corey, I wanted to open it up to anyone else who's in this space and sitting with the box and thinking about what has been shared. Any examples or definitions or roadmaps to mobilizing community partnership? I will say though, next week we will be talking about this as well, much more in depth. Next week is Power on Purpose, and we will actually share some real-time tips for mobilizing. But there's so many different things, and you may have to try multiple things before you get to something that works. And that's another thing I think brings up fear because of imperfection. We don't want to mess up, right? We have to be humble, and we have to be okay with mistakes. Meg, come on in. Wait, is it Meg? Yes, Meg. Hi.
Hi again. I was just going to share. I love that question. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was the organization of these crisis care guidance work groups at the state level to start to maybe get ready to shift how we organize for people who are very sick, who are coming into the hospital, and maybe even prioritizing who gets care. That was of extreme concern to the disability community. And I think one of the things that we leaned in on in Montana, and then I was, again, I think going back to Stephanie, part of my role is identifying who the trusted partners of the disability community are to place on our state work group. And so we were able to organize with our doctors and our hospital leaders an inclusive group that included me and our advocacy coordinator for the state of Montana's Summit Independent Living Center and our disability rights organization, so that we were looking at what is our roadmap, if I'm using this right, for handling situations where we have we have the surge, right? And we don't have the resources to treat the whole community. And what are some of our concerns in terms of our decision points, and how they might lead to bias and discrimination against people with disabilities and other groups. And it was a really important part of putting forward our crisis care guidance standards and protocols. I don't know if I'm on track with the roadmap.
Thank you, Meg. No, thank you for sharing. I think all sharing could be helpful in this space. Again, we don't know where people are on their journey. And I saw the question was to participants, but I would also offer, like, a starting point to mobilize folks is to come together around your values. It's really just sit down and have a conversation. I found that to be one of the most powerful things that happened both when I was working in a health department, is having monthly conversations that I started because I felt like we had to go beyond training. And then it was also something I was doing personally within my community organizing work. And I was like, why can't we do this here? Like, what is stopping us? I mean, I learned what was kind of stopping us, but I did it anyway. And I had people that came along for 2 years and had monthly conversations. And what we were able to do because of that information that comes through relational infrastructure, we were able to make small changes that now when I look back were really big deals. But when we were in it, it didn't feel like that because it was very incremental. It was based on continued conversations, because as you continue having these discussions, you continue learning and growing together, and you continue to learn your role in a space that is brave, may not be always safe, but it's in a community with people who are saying, this is how we're agreeing to be in community together. This is what we can talk about, and we're gonna open it up for truth. So yeah. Oh, I see something in the chat box. I'm not sure if that would be helpful for anyone, but starting with conversations seems very foreign because it's not something we honor or we count. It's not measurable and observable, right? So where do we put that when we're collecting data? But relationships are probably the most important. The important things that you can be building in the off moment, right? We're thinking right now, this is COVID-19, but we need to be building relationships before the next disaster comes, because we see who's continuously being minoritized when these things come around. So what are we ensuring before that happens? What are we doing right now to build for the future? And I also saw, before I invite Stephanie in, I saw that Kyle dropped something in the chat. Much appreciation to everyone who shared today, thinking of the experiences shared in the box. It reminds me of the importance of self-reflexivity, or the ability to ask, if we look, I love this, objectively at our practices and organizational culture, what do we actually produce through our work? And where is that in conflict with our stated narrative and values? Bring it in, Kyle. How are our practices aligning with our values? That's why you got to name those values. This is very real. And thank you. I want to know what people's values are. In fact, that's how I work. I meet around values and I build relationship, and I will decide to work with a partner based on those interactions and those relationships. I don't leave folks behind. I invite folks to come along and continue doing the work, but I had to do my work, and I continue to do that on this journey, and thus others must do that too. And it's messy and it's beautiful and it's human. Stephanie, come on. I see you're hopping around for me. I don't see. Okay.
There I am.
There you go.
I mean, what I wanted to say was, COVID taught us a lot of lessons. And one thing that has done that has allowed us to communicate with people in platforms like this, of people all around the country. But the thing for me that is really important is not to forget how important it is to have that human personal contact, to invite people to break bread, to be around that table. And that really helps us to build our values. And so we're getting back to those things, and it has to be intentional because we are all so busy, and to make time in our schedules to do that is imperative. I work with a number of people, and it's so easy for us to all now say, oh, I'm going to just put my hair up today, and I'm going to stay in my sweats, and I don't want to, go out and meet people in person. But that personal connection, that connectivity that helps us to further build that bond and that trust, where we are taking time out of our schedules to make a concerted effort for us to meet in person and to have that human bond and contact, I think is so important. And part of that we lost during COVID. And I want to encourage everybody to bring that back whenever possible.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I love that, Kyle. I love that you dropped this in the chat. And I don't know if you wanted to share more around that. I know I just took it in and kind of moved on with it because it is something that resonated with me. Is why are we coming together and what do we have in common and how do we move forward together? It sounds really basic, but that is the baseline of it. Stephanie, you're right. Breaking bread. Building bridges is what I call it. Breaking bread and building. You can do many things breaking bread. You can learn about different cultures. It is a human need. I often say that we all have to satisfy. It is where we can connect shared humanity and learn across differences that provide us and should not divide us. So I love it. That was a lot of the work I was doing in Durham, North Carolina, which is a different kind of place, but it doesn't mean it can't happen in other places as well. And just because something hasn't been done, you all, doesn't mean it can't be. When you start asking, why do we do things this way? And you get to the root of it, you may realize, oh, well, somebody 30 years ago put this in place and we haven't revisited since. It really could be that simple, or it could be difficult. Some of the things that we have existing in our organizations change and shift with political landscape. We have to be honest about that. You know, if you work within government, public health. So we know that there are many intricacies and there are many overlapping layers. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means it may take some time. Thus, everything we've been, that has come to be at this moment. Thank you for everything you all have shared. Is there anything else from the participants? It's coming up for you all as far as anything that you've done or heard of in your respected places around mobilizing partnerships with community, or anything that we shared around thinking outside the box instead of checking it. Okay, we want to stop checking the box and we want to challenge the box. We don't want to change it. I mean, I want to chuck it, but we are challenging the box instead of checking it. It's a lot of word alliteration for a statement there. It is definitely the health educator in me. Really hones in on this idea around transactions. So our box, we've been mulling over, continue to look at that box, and that box actually called white supremacy, culture, and characteristics. The middle of that box that I put in there, there's a whole discipline around this. I did want to share that this slide has the picture of the white supremacy culture as in like in these medicine bottles. It's one of the pictures from the actual website. A great chapter. Okay. It's that, am I doing that? Or is that just happening in the background? Are we recording?
It's a background thing. I'm going to check on it.
Okay, all good. It's just a couple of more slides. I just wanted to read out loud that this is a process with no end and no set arrival point. It is a constant state of change that adapts to new information and that gains wisdom and insight from dynamic conditions and perspectives. It acknowledges the status quo and opposing racist forces working to block equity-driven systems change. That box is a blocker. And once we can name it, we can normalize conversations on how to shift away from letting it keep us buried, keeping us away from equity. Conflict is going to be inherent to this process of transformation. We must know this, but it should be welcomed as a sign of change and growth. Growing pains I mean, growing pains, use that term. Shifting power to be collectively dispersed across people and communities and toppling the hierarchies that assign value based on identity or social positionality is not an easy process. Again, we are socialized, but our mutual liberation and transformation depends on it. Our liberation is bound. And real change starts with recognizing that we are part of the systems we seek to change. The fear and distrust that we seek to remedy also exist within us, as do the anger, sorrow, doubt, and frustration. So remember, this is not meant to be easy work, and it doesn't mean it's not possible. That if we're moving from this left side corner of transaction or performance, which perpetuates power imbalance, up to the right upper hand corner of transformation, which is messy and has all these intricate parts that we may not even be able to comprehend, but practicing is what promotes progress, not perfection. And that indeed, in order for us to move away from transactional ways of being and doing to transformation requires trust. And the vehicle of trust will not go without truth and the gas of transparency. So this is my visual. We cannot build trust without truth or transparency. We cannot get to transformation without trust. And so when we're thinking about transactional relationships, we are thinking about detached professional communication. We want to work around that. We want to stop thinking about transactions for efficiency and just to get to it and get it done, right? We want to think about impact. We don't want to just reach out acknowledging people when we need something. We actually want to think about transactional deliverables or goals to be ranked above meaningful engagement, qualitative goals, and rushing to achieve numbers and train more people versus building new and stronger partnerships. So shifting from transactional relationships and goals to transformational relationships and goals, the pathway is focusing on how we be together, not just what we're doing together. We want to think about people over production, profit, and power imbalance. Right now, we are still here in transactional, but because of these conversations and learning and growing, I know that change can happen. If it didn't happen, I wouldn't be here right now. And so I did want to end on that very inspirational, motivational piece there, that we are in this together, that it doesn't stop with one person or one discipline, and that we are all doing our own work individually, doing our work as institutions, and eventually we will trickle out into society with a better house that holds all of us, with all that we need. Is there anything you all want to share? I know we have about 7 minutes left. I know we have to drop the poll, and I want to hold this space for you all.
If you all have any resources or websites or examples that you have around that mobilizing partners strategy for this CDC grant, it would be so helpful if you put those in the chat. I know, Kyle, you put something in the chat around kind of what your team might be working through related to that content. But I really am curious if we are able to offer some different connections around what other grantees are doing for this anonymous case presenter. That would be really helpful. So feel free to add into the chat maybe examples of what you all are doing when it comes to mobilizing partners and collaborators.
Thank you, Corey. I just put in the chat a link to, this might be helpful also for next week, just as a foreshadow, that we're doing Power on Purpose. And this was a webinar through Human Impact Partners around power building for health departments. They are an organization that I absolutely adore, and I love the work that they're doing. And it's a great thing to check out or to use as a supplement for next week, just to have an idea. Again, we're always looking for resources, but really about the conversation today that Corey was just bringing in around how to mobilize partnerships. Now, this is for health departments. So if you know of any health departments or work with some or are part of one, share with your colleagues around mobilizing partnerships on purpose and with intention so that you're not creating harm or perpetuating harm. Anything else? Oh, thank you, Nikki. I saw that you dropped the poll. I think that was you. If not,
It was Serena. I will not
thank
take
you, Serena. I appreciate
credit.
you. I also want to give a shout out to our ASL interpreters. Thank you so much. Our card captioners. Thank you so much. Hearts, minds, hands in the background, all needed today, all valuable, and we appreciate you. Thank you, Meg, of course, for all of your contributions. How we value lives that more direct conversations are needed. Yeah. Why did we let go of that in our workspaces? I found that, oh, I don't know if we ever had it, y'all, but I found that learning more about my colleagues really helped us work better together. And I was also able to be more supportive of people as well. Okay, anyone else want to share anything? Consulting team, is there anything you all want to drop or share? No,
I'm on mute, sorry. I
Okay.
just wanted to remind everyone that we will have our concluding session next week, same day, same time. So we will see you there.
Yes, and thank you for your time today and trekking with us on this journey. Appreciate you, small and all. And that concludes our time together. You have a few minutes. Don't say I never gave you anything. See you next week.
Thank you so
Kyle,
much.
so much.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you, Stephanie, Jordan, of course, our panelists, amazing.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.